Recording by Avai in November 2016. Secresy or The Ruin on the Rock by Eliza Fenwick. Volume 1, Letter 5, from Caroline Ashburn to Sibella Valmont. Yes, dearest Sibella, charming Sibella, in that one short but rapid sentence you have taught me to understand your progress, from shyness to familiarity, from familiarity to kindness, from kindness to love, all-powerful, all-potent. Oh, be that love happy in its continuance as at its commencement! Be it the pure garb of your Clement's soul, upon which vice shall leave no spot nor wrinkle. Be it, as you say, that your hearts, your affections, your principles are the same, and I would trust this lover amidst allurements such as virtue held, seldom rejected, had seldom turned from without contamination. Your uncle, my Sibella, I perceive, intended you for your lover, and your lover for you. His project, then, was to place a second Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Well, Sibella, innocence remains with you. Your Eden will yet bloom, for, trust me, innocence and happiness cannot long be separated. Why will that uncle of yours so strenuously uphold his mysterious reserve and silence? Ah, I long to ask him a million of questions, and he knows that I do, and he wishes that I should. It is not because he is altogether convinced of the wisdom and utility of his plans that he does plan. It is that he will oppose himself to general customs and general experience. It is singularity and not perfection that he is in search of, and, since experience formerly taught him that even the renowned name of Valmont might mix undistinguished with a herd of less illustrious names, he now bravely resolves to enforce the wonder of his compeers, if he cannot claim their reverence. Perhaps, with the flattering promises of success, he sometimes soothes the rancour of his solitude. And occasionally, indeed, his existence is remembered, and his whimsies are made the subject of ridicule, contempt, and laughter, but some novel circumstance, such as the gay Mrs. Ashburn's visit to his gloomy retirement, must call them into this remembrance, or the name of Mr. Valmont would rest as undisturbed as does, in every memory but his own, the deeds of his forefathers. It is to my mother's excursion to Valmont Castle that I owe the felicity of calling you my friend. It is to her escape from thence, as she herself terms it, that I owe my knowledge of Mr. Valmont's history. Surrounded on her arrival at the house of Sir Thomas Barlow by a crowd of visitors, as gay, profuse, and dissipated as herself, she hastens to communicate her joy at the agreeable change, and to inveigh against the morose Mr. Valmont and his insipid wife. A conversation ensued of some length for such a subject, during which I discovered that two of the party, the Earl of Ulson and Colonel Ridson, were once the intimate companions of Mr. Valmont. The former of these gentlemen appeared eager to place his defects in the strongest point of view, while the latter, with less zeal, to be sure, but with a sweetness of temper infinitely endearing, was willing to smooth the rugged parts of Mr. Valmont's character, and to place a vice behind the glare of a virtue. By setting aside, to the best of my judgment, the Earl's exaggerations, and making also some allowance for the palliative temper of Colonel Ridson, I had succeeded in learning as much of Mr. Valmont's history as enabled me to form some, and I believe no inaccurate estimate of his worth, abilities, and character. Your grandfather, Sibella, a being quite as eccentric, though less whimsical than your uncle, lived in the castle you now inhabit. Nor would he, of his own free will, have quitted that castle for heaven itself. Every stone of the building that had kept its station in times of turbulence and discord against the attack of an enemy was to him an idol. If he was thoughtful, it was in recalling the great deeds of his ancestors. If he was talkative, it was on the same theme. If he had wishes, they were that he had lived in those glorious days, when fighting well was the most eminent of virtues, and a strong fortified castle and obedient vassals the most valuable of possessions. As is the established practice in families of such renown and dignity as that to which you, my friend, appertain, the first-born son of your grandfather was the only hope, the only joy, the only object of the careful solitude of his anxious parents, while your father, coming into the world 2 years after his brother, was adored, flattered, and spoiled by no creature but his nurse. Your uncle, I understand, received a stately kind of education within the castle walls, and your father, happier because of less consequence, passed his early years with other young men of fashion at school and at college. Mr. Valmont was not a whit behind his father in his veneration for high birth, but he could not boast so unqualified a love of fruits of armour, nor did he think that civil war was the only time when a man could gather honours worthy of a distinguished name. No sooner was your uncle emancipated from the fetters of his minority than he resolved to repair to court, where he expected to find only his equals, and those equals alive to and exact in the observance of all that haughty decorum which Mr. Valmont deemed indispensably necessary to the well-being of social institutions. Poor man! He feels himself lost in the motley multitude, sees his high-born pretensions to notice and deference pushed aside by individuals obscure in their origin, but renowned for artful intrigues, for bold perseverance and dazzling success. Shocked at the contaminating mixture, he had fled back with precipitancy to his castle, but love detained him, for he had made an offering of his heart to a woman of rank and fashion. Nothing could be more unfortunate than this passion. Nothing further from congeniality than the minds and manners of Lady Margaret B. and Mr. Valmont. He, just risen, as it were, from the tomb of his progenitors, loaded with the punctilio of the last age, recoiling from the salute of every man who could not boast an unblemished pedigree, and lastly, and most worthily, possessing refined ideas of female delicacy, of honourable love, and of unchanging fidelity. And she, on the contrary, a graceful coquette, without an atom of real tenderness in her heart, and valuing her rank merely as it gave her opportunities of extending her conquest. Lady Margaret B. was highly diverted with Mr. Valmont's formalities, and, in spite of the torture her dissipated coquettish manners inflicted on him, she had sufficient power to make him the most ardent of her lovers. In fine, she rejected him, laughed at him, despised him. I could not hear this anecdote, nor can I repeat it, without a sensation of pain, so strongly do I enter into the irritable feelings of your uncle, when, hitherto accustomed only to receive homage and obedience, he is at once foiled in his ambition by low-born courtiers, and betrayed in his love by a high-born jilt. Mr. Valmont consulted no other guide than his passions, and instantly drew an angry and false picture of mankind. With such people as I have spoken of he could not associate, for their vices he abhorred, but his mind had not fortitude enough, had not comprehension enough, to cast aside his own prejudices, and, instead of attempting to reform mankind, he retires to rail at them, and carries with him the pride, selfishness, and love of power, in which all the vices of society originate. Wrapped in the impenetrable selfishness of high birth, Mr. Valmont denies the possibility of eminent virtue existing without rank. Who shall presume to arraign his principles, to sit in judgment upon his actions, to teach him his duty? I stand, cries Mr. Valmont, within the sacred verge of nobility. Look on that coat of arms, I derive from the Normans. Wisdom in rags, keep off. True, his ancestors conquered, that he should be wise. Oh, cede to him the palm, bind his brows with the laurel. After a few months' retirement, Mr. Valmont ventured once more into the heterogeneous multitude, in search of a wife, for I suspect he found himself as ill qualified for solitude as society. Beside, he had formed the virtuous project of instructing a new race, to put the old world out of countenance. I cannot but pause to reflect upon your uncle's toils in search of his helpmate. He must have a wife whose pedigree his future sons might place beside his own, and he must have one of a temperament and character opposite to that of Lady Margaret B., and his good stars, his ill stars, or whatever else you please, led him to the feet of Mrs. Valmont. It is true, your aunt was neither as coquettish, nor had she the sprightly wit, nor the mischievous gaiety of Lady Margaret, but she loved crowds, detested solitude, and was a votary of dissipation. To convince her how much he had studied her inclinations, and how much he meant to gratify them, no sooner was Mr. Valmont in possession of his bride than he snatched her from the scenes where her existence was alone valuable to her, and buried her amidst obscurity and horror at Valmont Castle. What is the consequence? She had no mental accomplishments in reserve for their mutual benefit and delight, nor had he mind enough to steal fire from heaven and animate with life the marble. From the struggle of tempers and the warfare of words, she droops into a hypochondriac, he degenerates into a cynic, proud of himself alone. Among the disappointments produced by his marriage, the want of children was the most offensive to Mr. Valmont. Your father, who had pursued a course of life quite different from his brother, tasting all the excesses of dissipation, died, and, very improperly in my opinion, left you to the guardianship of your uncle. That Mr. Valmont should adopt a son from the lowly condition of a cottager's child has occasioned much wonder and many surmises. However, as I do not find anything material either to you or me in the conjectures I have listened to on this occasion, I shall not be at the pains of relating them. But how comes it to pass, my dearest Sibella, that when your uncle had the means of gratifying his darling wish in educating 2 children, and one of them a female, to whom according to his creed nothing should be granted beyond what the instinct of appetite demands, how comes it, I say, that you possess the comprehensive powers of intellect? From what sources did you derive that eager desire of knowledge, of which I find you possessed, and how came you to be learned on subjects which, in the education of females, are strictly withheld, to make room for trifling gaudy and useless accomplishments? Tell me by what miracle I find you such as you are, and let me cease to wonder at you, but never let me cease to love you. Tell me, too, how came you to be dependent on your uncle? Does your dependence only mean the protection due from him who stands in the place of a parent to you? I wish to be informed what explanation Mr. Valmont and yourself affix to the term of dependent when it is applied to you, for Colonel Ridson talks so familiarly of the fortune you must possess from your mother, and also the wealth of the Valmont family, which he says is yours by heirship, that I must own I am puzzled. I care little about your being rich, but it seems unnatural and unjust to have you a dependent on your haughty uncle." "Ah, my dear Sibella, how often in a day do I feast my imagination by allowing it to bear me back to you! And yet, perhaps, our separation gives a spur, a stimulus to our friendship. I am not convinced, indeed, but that temporary separations are even useful between lovers, and that Mr. Valmont may have acted rather wisely than otherwise in parting you and your Clement for a season. Why he should bid you remember him only as a brother is really too far plunged into obscurity for me to discover. Do not, however, suppose for an instant that my affection for you would decay were I at liberty to enjoy your society as I wish. On the contrary, I am persuaded that every hour I should pass with you would add something to my improvement, and render us more valuable to each other. My expression arose from my being at that moment in idea a partner of your seclusion, and feeling that I should want in the same situation that energy and activity which is the support of your solitude. I am fond of society, and indeed I find myself most excited when I have most opportunities of observing the various characters and pursuits of those around me. Gladly would I possess the power of selecting my society. From that happy privilege I am debarred. But I seldom make one of a circle in which I do not find some novelty of character, and something either of excellence or absurdity from which I may draw improvement. Yet a 2 months' visit at the villa of Sir Thomas Barlow is rather a hard trial of my patience, and, unless we are enlivened by new visitors, I fear the company here will afford me but a trifling harvest of observation. I shall soon be glad to turn from them to my own resources, and fly, even oftener than I do now, to the ever-vivifying remembrance of my Sibella. Sir Thomas Barlow has risen from some very obscure station to the wealth and dignity of a nabob. He has risen too, I greatly fear, by the same depredating practices, which the unfortunate natives of India seem destined constantly to suffer from those who perfidiously call themselves the protectors of the country. Sir Thomas Barlow's riches have become his punishment. Each morning his fears awaken with his faculties, lest that day should bring tidings of the dreaded scrutiny, and when evening arrives, and he struggles to yield himself to mirth and wine amidst the circle he has assiduously gathered round him, a word, a look, or the most remote hint or allusion gives his watchful terrors an alarm. A sudden turn of his head, perchance, discovers his shadow on the wall. Legions of threatening phantoms then crowd upon his apprehension, and the evening, yet more miserable than the day, concludes with an opiate, administered to lull the feeble body into lethargy, and hush the perturbed conscience into silence. And my mother can look on this existing fact with indifference, while I shudder. Those enormous sums of wealth she lavishes away, that cluster of pearls she triumphantly places in her hair, those diamonds heaped into different ornaments, how were they obtained? Thousands, perhaps. Oh, Sibella, I have laid aside my ornaments. A dress plain as yours supersedes them. Lady Barlow is a composition of a very curious kind. She is about 40 years younger than her husband, is tolerably pretty, and has a showy talent of repartee that she mistakes for a sublime genius, and her inclinations are perpetually at warfare, without being able to decide whether she shall be most renowned as a wit or a beauty. She is extravagantly fond of admiration, which she formerly enjoyed unlimitedly, being the head toast of a small country town, till she became the wife of a nabob. Prosperity has not increased her happiness, for in the great and gay world she has found rivals of such magnitude that malice and envy have sprung up within that bosom which till now owned no inmate but vanity. These are our host and hostess. The first in precedency among the visitors ranks the Earl of Ulson, an antiquated gallant, who in public affects not to feel the approaches of age, and in private broods over the consciousness of its effects till he sickens with ill nature. The Countess of Ulson hates her husband, nor has she overmuch charity and goodwill towards other men. She talks largely, indeed, of her piety and the strict performance of her manifold duties. This amiable pair are attended by their son and 2 daughters. Lord Bowden is so perfectly satisfied within himself that, if you will take his word for it, there is not a more amiable and accomplished young man in England. His elder sister, Lady Mary Bowden, claims no praise beyond what is justly due to the complacency of her temper. She is at once too giddy and too indolent to aim at meriting a more enlarged praise. She loves dress, company, cards, and scandal, and indulges herself in the use of the latter as a mere matter of course, without entertaining the smallest particle of ill will towards the very persons she helps to vilify. I have endeavoured to convince Lady Mary of the folly of this practice, and she acknowledges that what I say appears very much to the purpose, but then how can she cease to do what everybody does? All the beauty that exact regularity of feature and transparency of complexion can bestow is in the possession of the Earl of Ulson's youngest daughter, Lady Laura Bowden. Beyond this description I hardly know what to say of her. I can perceive she entertains a very hearty contempt for her sister, and perhaps she may hold me in as little estimation, but a woman so perfectly well bred as Lady Laura does not display such sentiments, if she entertains them, unless some species of rivalship should unfortunately call her passions into action. I do not think her either witty or wise, yet I have been told she bears the reputation of the former, and is poet enough occasionally to pen a rebus or an acrostic. It may be so. I have not been favoured with her confidence. A delicate languor pervades her manners, and this is generally honoured with the name of sensibility. I am apt to call it affectation, for the sensibility that I understand and admire is extreme only in proportion to the greatness of the occasion. It does not waste itself in vapours, nor is it ever on the watch for wasps and spiders. Colonel Ridson assures me that Lady Laura Bowden is admired by the whole world, and that he must be the happiest of men on whom her ladyship bestows a preference. Colonel Ridson loves his white teeth and his epaulet. He likes everybody, praises everybody, is attentive to everybody, lives without attachment, and will probably die in the same torpid state, without ever knowing felicity or ordinary misfortune. The Colonel hitherto has been the only unmarried man amongst us, except Lord Bowden, who really is so assiduous in remembering his own recommendations that no one else finds it necessary to remember him or them at all. But we are now to be enlivened. It seems we damsels are to be excited to call forth our charms for the conquest of a youth of no common value, as his fame goes here. Sir Thomas Barlow's nephew, Mr. Murden, arrived at the villa this very day. I know not why I should be particularly selected from the party by Sir Thomas Barlow to listen to his encomiums on his nephew. From the most insignificant occurrences, the baronet has constantly occasion to say, "Ha! Ha! Miss Ashburn, if my nephew Arthur was but come." If I praised a dish of fruit at table, the nabob's nephew Arthur had certainly done the same thing. Let me speak of walking or riding, let me complain of hail, rain, or sunshine, Arthur was still my promised chaperon, the future knight-errant of all my grievances. "Tell me something," said I one day to Colonel Ridson, "of this Mr. Murden, this hope of the family." "He is very handsome," replied the Colonel. "But is he good?" "Assuredly." "And amiable?" "Infinitely." "And wise?" "To a miracle, madam," replied the Colonel. "Good, amiable, wise! Who could desire more?" Lady Mary Bowden stood beside me one afternoon while the baronet was reminding me of his dear Arthur. "Sir Thomas, I believe, intends," said I to her, "that I shall be in love by anticipation. You know Mr. Murden. What is he?" "Oh!" cried Lady Mary, lifting up her right hand to enforce the spirit of her emphasis, "he is the most abominable rake in the universe." I absolutely started. "Is it possible, Lady Mary, you should mean what you say?" I asked after a moment's pause. "Yes, certainly," replied her ladyship, quite gaily. "Everybody knows of hundreds with whom he has been a very happy man." "I do not want," said I, "to hear what everybody says. I want, Lady Mary, to know your own sincere opinion of Mr. Murden. If you have already told me a fact, my situation, to be sure, will oblige me to be sometimes in his company. But, in that case, there exists not a reptile, however noxious or despicable, from whom I should shrink with more abhorrence than from this boasted nephew of the Nabob." "Good God!" cried Lady Mary. "Why? What did I say? I protest I have forgotten already. I am sure I know no harm in the world of Mr. Murden." "Did you not tell me he was an abominable rake?" "They say so," replied Lady Mary. "He certainly is very engaging. He admires fine women. But I don't know whether he has ever made serious addresses to any one. Miss Ashburn, I'll tell you a secret." "You had better not. I don't keep secrets." "Oh, all the world knows it already. Lady Laura is quite fond of Murden. You would have laughed to have seen her last winter, as I did, plunged over head and ears in sentiment and sensibility. Well, I do hate affectation." "And you do love good nature." "So I do," said she, smiling, "and I hope with all my heart that my poor sister may now secure her conquest, unless, indeed, Miss Ashburn, it should interfere with you." Neither the baronet's hints, the colonel's all good, all wise, nor the motley dubious character given by Lady Mary Bowden of Mr. Murden would have tempted me to devote thus much of my paper to him. I have other inducements. I have heard that the domestics of Barlowe Hall anxiously expected the day of his coming. A gardener, who has been discharged for no worse fault, I believe, than his being too old, assures himself that the prosperity of him and his family will be restored when Mr. Murden arrives. I have heard also that the neighbouring cottagers bless him. Such a man must have worth. Agnes, who is zealous to tell me all the good she can of any one, has related several anecdotes of Mr. Murden, from which I learn that he possesses sympathy and benevolence. I cannot tell how such qualities can exist in the mind of a man who is, either in principle or practice, a libertine. Yes, Agnes also had been told that Mr. Murden was a libertine. I bade her inquire more, and she could hear of no particular instances wherein the peace of individuals or families had been injured by him. Still, those with whom Agnes conversed bestowed on him this hateful title. I fear the reproach may belong to him. Young men are frequently carried into these excesses, from the pernicious effect of example, sometimes from vanity, and from a variety of other causes, all which tend to one uniform effect, to destroy the understanding, deprave the heart, corrupt the disposition, and render loathsome and detestable a being that might have lived an honour and a blessing to his species. If Mr. Murden is indeed devoted to this error, farewell to his benevolent virtues, to his sense of justice, and farewell to the pleasure and instruction I might have gained in the society of a virtuous man. I said Mr. Murden was already arrived, but I have not seen him. He paid his duty to his uncle in the baronet's own apartment, and then retired to dress before he would present himself in the breakfast-parlour. Lady Laura appeared impatient. She was adorned in a new morning dress, perfectly graceful and becoming. The hour came in which I was to write to my Sibella, and I would not sacrifice that employment for 20 such introductions. Farewell, my friend. Close to your altar of love raise one of friendship, and I also will meet you at the Oak. Caroline Ashburn. End of section 5.